He chose money over family, then saw her 6 years later, with 2 daughters who looked just like him. The last time Jane saw Adam Reeves, she stood motionless in the doorway of his luxury penthouse as he buttoned his tailored blazer, the skyline of the city glowing behind him like something unreachable. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but he was already walking away. Adam, the youngest CEO in his company's history, the golden boy of the tech world, didn't even glance back as he said the words that would echo in her memory for years to come: "Money matters more than a family with you." There was no fight, no closure. Just those words, so sharp, so final. He didn't know that she had come to tell him something life-changing. He hadn't given her a chance. Only moments before, Jane had learned she was pregnant. She had held that knowledge in her heart like something delicate, not quite real, and now it felt as though he had crushed it under his polished shoes without ever knowing it was there. The door closed behind him with a sound too soft for how loud it felt inside her chest. She stood still, her hand resting on her abdomen, not yet showing, not yet anything anyone could see. But she knew. And now she was alone. Completely alone. The silence of the apartment was deafening. This was not how her life was supposed to go. When she met Adam, she had been swept into a whirlwind of charm, intelligence, ambition, and luxury. But somewhere between the private jets and the champagne dinners, she had begun to feel invisible. He never talked about the future, not with her in it. Still, she hadn't expected him to walk away so completely, so heartlessly. That night, Jane packed what little she had at his place, just a few clothes and her worn-down shoes. She didn't cry as much as she expected. Something inside her had locked up, some quiet survival instinct already working. By the time she stepped out into the cold air of the city with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, she wasn't the same woman anymore. The girl who once dreamed of a fairy tale life with a brilliant man was gone. In her place was someone new, frightened, yes, but also fierce in a way she hadn't known she could be. She moved into a tiny one-room studio in a forgotten neighborhood on the edge of the city. No heat, barely working plumbing, and the sound of traffic that never stopped, but it was hers. The morning sickness started not long after. She threw up between job interviews, during long walks to save on subway fare, and in the silence of her dark apartment where the walls felt too close. But through it all, she whispered to the growing life inside her, a promise over and over again: "You're not alone. I'm still here." She got a job answering phones at a dusty second-hand bookstore and spent her evenings taking online courses, hoping that if she worked hard enough, maybe, just maybe, she could give this child a life worth having. One night, lying on the lumpy mattress on the floor, she ran her hand over her belly and felt the slightest flutter, movement, real and undeniable. That was the moment it hit her: she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. Something that mattered more than all the power and wealth Adam Reeves had walked away to protect. She wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying her future. And she was going to protect it with everything she had. The twins arrived on a cold morning in early spring, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Jane had gone into labor alone, terrified, gripping the edge of the counter in her tiny kitchen as the pain tore through her. She had no family nearby, no one waiting in the hospital lobby, just a worn overnight bag and the quiet resolve that had become her armor. At the hospital, the nurses were kind but busy, and no one asked if there was someone they should call. Jane didn't offer a name. There was no one to call. Hours later, she held 2 tiny girls in her arms, both wrapped in thin hospital blankets, their matching cries like high, uncertain music in the sterile delivery room. Emma was born first, red-faced and loud, with strong lungs and determined fists. Avery followed minutes later, quieter, blinking up at the world with large, deep blue eyes that reminded Jane immediately of him. Both girls had blonde tufts of hair and the same dimpled chin that had once charmed half the financial district. They were unmistakably his, but they were hers now, completely and absolutely. The early days blurred into sleepless nights, rushed feedings, and exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Jane had never changed a diaper before. Now she changed dozens a day. The girls rarely slept at the same time. When one cried, the other stirred. When one finally fell quiet, the other whimpered. Jane rocked them on her chest in the dark, singing songs she could barely remember the words to, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep but steady with love. There were moments when she broke down, once, on the floor beside the crib, whispering apologies for not being enough, for not having more to give, but even in those moments, she never wished things different. Never wished them gone. They were her entire world. She went back to work after 8 weeks, not because she was ready, but because she had no choice. Her boss at the bookstore allowed her to bring the girls for short shifts at first. Jane set up a little space behind the front desk with blankets and bottles, and while she answered phones and sorted inventory, her daughters slept beside her in donated bassinets. She breastfed during lunch breaks and pumped in the bathroom. It wasn't sustainable, but it was survival, and she clung to it with both hands. At night, she studied for her early childhood certification. Her laptop perched on the edge of the table, the girls in their second-hand crib just feet away. She listened to lectures with headphones while bouncing Avery's chair with her foot. Every test passed felt like a small rebellion against the future people had assumed for her. She wasn't a statistic. She was building something better. They grew slowly but surely, chubby cheeks, wobbly steps, first giggles. Emma was fearless and quick to anger, Avery gentler, observant. Jane kept a small notebook where she wrote down milestones, even the quiet ones. She never posted photos online. She didn't want Adam to see. She didn't know if he even remembered her name, but the thought of him finding them was something she both feared and resented. He didn't deserve them. Not after how easily he'd thrown her away. One afternoon, when the girls were almost 2, a stranger at the park remarked how much they looked like their father. Jane smiled tightly and changed the subject. But that night, as she watched them sleep in the same bed, their blonde heads turned toward each other, she realized something had shifted. The fear was still there, but so was pride. Her daughters were growing into something extraordinary, not in spite of their beginnings, but because of the fight she had poured into every minute of their lives. She kissed their foreheads and whispered again, "You're not alone. You never were." Then she sat by the window, looking out at the flickering city, wondering if fate would ever circle back around, or if this was the life she had chosen to guard forever. By the time Emma and Avery turned 5, their laughter filled every corner of their modest 2-bedroom apartment. The walls, once bare and peeling, were now covered with their drawings, crayon-colored rainbows, messy stick-figure families, and hearts with "Mommy" scrawled in backward letters. Jane had done what many thought impossible. She had raised 2 bright, kind, beautiful little girls while holding down a job, earning her early childhood education certificate, and rebuilding herself one fragile day at a time. Her schedule was still exhausting. She worked full-time as a teaching assistant at a local preschool, often arriving before sunrise to set up crafts and snack time. The pay was just enough to keep them afloat, and she supplemented it by offering weekend babysitting for a few of the center's families. Most evenings, Jane returned home bone-tired but smiling, because the girls would run to the door, arms open, shouting over each other to tell her every little detail of their day. They were inseparable, Emma, bold and impulsive, always taking the lead, and Avery, more thoughtful, often stopping to observe the world around her before jumping in. Jane had long since stopped waiting for recognition or applause. She didn't need it. The evidence of her strength lived in the way her daughters hugged their classmates, how they shared even their favorite snacks, and how they never ended a day without saying, "I love you," to each other, and to her. Still, there were moments that stung. Occasionally, other parents would ask where the girl's father was. Jane had perfected the art of the gentle smile and the firm, "It's just us, and we're okay." She had promised herself never to let bitterness define her, but there were nights she stared at the ceiling, wondering if he ever thought about them, if he would recognize his own eyes staring back at him through the blue of theirs. She doubted it. He had made his choice. And she had made hers, to never let his absence mean her daughters lacked love. It was on a rainy Tuesday that everything began to change. Jane had landed an interview for a position as a coordinator at a new early education program across town. The salary was almost double what she made now. It was a chance to finally move into a better neighborhood, maybe even save for the girl's future. She'd picked out her best blouse, rehearsed her answers, and brought the twins with her, unable to find childcare that afternoon. They wore matching white dresses with tiny blue flowers, their hair in neat braids. Despite the drizzle, they clutched each other's hands and skipped along the sidewalk, giggling under a shared umbrella. As they turned the corner toward the office building, Jane's heart skipped a beat. Standing at the steps of the lobby was a man in a slate-gray suit, his hair styled immaculately, eyes sharp and scanning his phone. Time hit her like a freight train. Adam Reeves. 6 years hadn't dulled the angles of his jaw or the presence he carried like armor. He looked just as untouchable as he always had, except now, her daughters were standing between them. Emma tugged on her hand. "Mommy, that man's looking at us," she whispered. Jane didn't speak. She could feel Adam's gaze shifting from her to the girls and back again. There was confusion in his face, then recognition, and finally, something she hadn't expected, shock. He took a hesitant step forward. Jane stiffened. The moment stretched. The sound of the rain, the traffic, even her own breathing seemed distant. His mouth opened, but for once, he had no words. Emma looked up at him, tilting her head with that same curious tilt Jane had seen in Avery. Avery, always observant, narrowed her eyes. "Why does he look like us?" she asked aloud. Jane's throat tightened. She took their hands. "Let's go." She walked past him without another glance, head high, heart racing, pulse thundering in her ears. Adam turned slowly, watching them disappear down the sidewalk, rain falling around him, his phone forgotten in his hand. And in that moment, Jane knew, everything was about to change. Whether she wanted it to or not. Adam couldn't sleep that night. The image of the two little girls, their blonde braids bouncing as they walked past him, haunted his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. Their eyes, his eyes, were what struck him most. Deep, unmistakable blue, a mirror of his own. He knew before he even asked himself the question. Somehow, someway, those girls were his. And the woman leading them with a face carved into his past like a scar, Jane, was the key to everything he had never realized he'd lost. He paced the penthouse suite that now felt too empty, too polished, too artificial. The silence pressed in, suffocating. For years, he had surrounded himself with efficiency, precision, and success. Business had boomed, his company had gone public, his wealth had multiplied, but suddenly, none of it mattered. He couldn't stop hearing the smallest girl ask, "Why does he look like us?" That innocent question shattered him more than any lawsuit or market crash ever had. By morning, he had made up his mind. He had to know the truth, and he had to hear it from her. He spent hours calling in favors, asking his personal assistant to find any trace of Jane. At first, there was nothing. She had no social media. No traceable employment history under her full name. But eventually, a contact from the city education department pointed to a preschool in the outer boroughs, where Jane Carter worked as a classroom aide. Adam didn't wait. He got in his car, canceled his meetings, and drove across the city. The school was small and cheerful, with a mural of cartoon animals painted across the front. Children's laughter echoed from a fenced play yard. He parked a few feet away and sat frozen in the driver's seat, unsure what he would say or how he would say it. What right did he have to show up now? What would she say when she saw him again? Jane had just stepped outside with the children for recess when their eyes met again. She stiffened, visibly tense, then calmly turned to the teacher beside her and whispered something. The other woman nodded, taking over the class, and Jane walked over to the gate, arms folded protectively across her chest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but steady. There was no warmth, but no fear either. She had grown stronger, sharper. He barely recognized the girl he once walked away from. "I need to talk to you," Adam said, his throat dry. "Please. You made your choice 6 years ago. I don't owe you anything now." "I didn't know," he said quickly, eyes locking on hers. "Jane, I swear to God, I didn't know. I left before you said anything." "And if I had," she asked, her expression unreadable, "would it have made a difference? Or would you have called your lawyer to make it disappear?" He flinched. "I would have stayed," he said. "I think about that night all the time. I regret every word I said." She looked away, silent for a moment. "They're my whole world, Adam. I didn't tell them about you because you weren't there. You don't get to walk back in now and pretend nothing happened." "I'm not pretending," he said quietly. I saw them. And I saw myself. And I realized I've spent 6 years chasing the wrong things." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a tired sigh, she said, "I need time. And you don't get to see them yet. If you're serious about this, about them, you'll have to prove it." "I will," Adam said, his voice breaking. Jane nodded slowly and turned to go back inside. As she walked away, he stood at the gate, watching the girls from a distance, playing on the swings. He saw Avery glance over at him with curiosity. Emma was laughing, hair flying in the wind. He felt the weight of 6 years crash down on his shoulders. And he knew, this was just the beginning of what would either be the hardest fight of his life or the only one that ever truly mattered. The following weeks were some of the longest of Adam's life. He wanted to rush forward, to demand access, to speak to his daughters, to learn who they were and what they loved. But he knew better now. He had lost the right to anything immediate. He had to earn back something far more difficult than wealth or success, trust. Jane hadn't blocked him or disappeared. She hadn't filed a restraining order or sent lawyers after him. Instead, she gave him silence. A careful, watchful silence, waiting to see whether he would follow through or fade again like he had once before. So he started small. He asked the school administrator if he could anonymously sponsor supplies for Jane's classroom. A week later, new books, learning materials, and art supplies arrived, labeled only as donations. He didn't sign his name. Then he visited the foundation he had once donated to in passing and committed to funding a scholarship program for single working mothers returning to school. When the board asked if he wanted publicity, he refused. Every move he made now was quiet, deliberate, grounded in sincerity, not a performance. At home, his penthouse felt colder than ever. He had once filled it with expensive furniture, abstract art, and award plaques that now looked meaningless. He started cleaning out entire rooms, packing away reminders of the man he had been. He spent his evenings researching parenting, early childhood development, how to build trust with kids who'd never met you. He reached out to a child psychologist, not for the girls, but for himself. He wanted to be better, not just seen as better. Weeks turned to a month before Jane called him again. Her voice was cautious, almost clinical, but she didn't hang up. "If you're serious," she said, "you can meet them. But not as their father. Not yet. As my friend." Adam understood. It wasn't a punishment, it was a test. And he was determined not to fail. Their first meeting took place at the local library during a weekend story time. Jane told the girls they were meeting a friend of hers from work. Adam showed up early, dressed casually, holding a bag of books he thought they might like. When they entered, the girls paused at the sight of him. He held his breath. Emma immediately narrowed her eyes with suspicion while Avery studied him quietly, tilting her head just slightly like Jane used to do when she was confused or curious. Jane introduced him as Mr. Adam. He smiled gently and crouched to their eye level, never reaching to touch, never forcing familiarity. "You brought books?" Avery asked, her voice light but cautious. "I did," he said. "One's about twins who go on an adventure to find a lost star. Thought it might be fun." Emma grabbed the book from him and flipped through the pages. "Do you read Good Voices?" she demanded. "I've been told I do," he said with a chuckle. Jane watched silently, her hands clenched in her lap, every nerve in her body alert. But Adam kept his distance, responding to the girls with patience and calm. He didn't dominate the conversation. He let them lead. He listened. When the librarian called the group for story time, the girls asked Adam to sit next to them. Jane's breath caught, but she let it happen. He sat on the floor with his long legs awkwardly crossed, caught between their tiny elbows, as the story began. Afterwards, they went for ice cream. Avery talked about her favorite books, and Emma argued over the best flavor. Adam asked gentle questions but never pushed. When it was time to leave, the girls waved without hesitation. Later that night, Jane called him. "You did well," she said. "They liked you." He closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "Thank you for giving me the chance." "I don't trust easily," she said. "But they liked you. That matters more than how I feel." He wanted to tell her how much he still thought about her. How sorry he was. But he didn't. Not yet. This wasn't about him and her anymore. This was about two little girls who didn't know they'd once been forgotten and who deserved only the truth, the safety, and the love they had never asked to earn. So he said only this: "Then I'll keep showing up. However long it takes." The weeks after their first meeting became a slow but steady rhythm. Adam showed up at the library every Saturday morning without fail, never late, always carrying new books or small games for the girls to explore. Sometimes they sat together through story time, other times they spread out in the children's reading corner, building paper castles and pretending to be explorers or queens. The girls began to expect him. Emma no longer studied him like a stranger, and Avery no longer hesitated before sitting beside him. They laughed with him now, asked him silly questions, and even began to argue over who got to sit on his lap when they played pretend. Still, Adam kept a respectful distance from Jane, never pushing her, never speaking of the past unless she brought it up. Outside those library visits, he continued to change his life. He stepped down from day-to-day control of his company, handing over leadership to his COO. He knew now that the empire he had built was empty without anyone to share it with, and no number of zeros in his bank account could replace the years he had missed. He began volunteering through the single-parent initiative he had helped fund. He spent afternoons reading to children in shelters and weekends visiting community events. Slowly, the sharpness in his voice softened. His suit stayed in his closet more often. He started biking instead of using a driver, began eating at local diners rather than expensive rooftop lounges. People noticed. He was changing. Meanwhile, Jane watched everything with guarded hope. She remained cautious, never wanting her daughters to become collateral damage in someone else's journey of redemption. But she couldn't ignore what she saw. Adam wasn't showing up just to be liked. He wasn't angling for forgiveness. He was there because he loved them, loved the girls and, in a quiet way, still carried something for Jane that time hadn't managed to erase. One afternoon, the library announced a family craft day. Jane debated not attending, nervous that being in such a space might blur lines she had worked so hard to draw. But the girls begged, and Adam had already said he would be there. So they went. The event was loud and chaotic, with children running between stations, glue sticks and glitter flying everywhere. Jane kept her distance at first, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching as Adam kneeled beside the girls, helping them create messy crowns out of pipe cleaners and paper jewels. At one point, Emma accidentally glued her fingers together and began to cry in frustration. Adam, instead of panicking, simply held out his hand and said, "I used to do that all the time. You want help or you want to do it yourself?" Emma sniffled, wiped her face on her sleeve, and nodded. "Together," she said. Jane watched from across the room, her heart full and aching at once. Later that day, Jane found herself sitting beside Adam on a bench while the girls played tag in the nearby park. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and for a moment, it was just the two of them in silence. "You're good with them," she said, surprising herself. He looked over, smiling softly. "They make it easy. They're amazing." "They are. But they're also intense, stubborn, loud. They've got their own rules for everything." "They get that from you," he said gently. Jane laughed, a sound she hadn't shared with him in years. It felt strange and familiar all at once. "I was angry for a long time," she admitted. "I still am, sometimes. But I see what you're doing. I see how you've changed. And I think they need you. Not just someone who visits once a week. They need a real father." Adam's expression shifted, relief, hope, fear, all at once. "I don't know how to do that," he said. "I've read the books. I've asked for advice. But every day I wake up terrified that I'll mess this up." Jane nodded slowly. "That means you're already doing better than most." They sat in silence again as the girls ran in circles, their laughter echoing through the trees. Later, as they walked home, Emma slipped her hand into Adam's without hesitation. Avery followed a second later. Jane walked behind them, watching the three of them together, the shape of a family forming not through perfection but through presence. It wasn't how she imagined it once. It was slower, messier, quieter. But it was real. That night, after the girls were tucked in and the apartment was quiet, Jane stood by the window staring out at the stars. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was doing it all alone. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe this story might still end in joy. The library's family craft day was the first time Jane allowed herself to relax in Adam's presence, though even she didn't realize it until much later. The event was simple: tables covered in colored paper, safety scissors, glue sticks, markers, and cheerful volunteers helping children create masks, cards, and paper flowers. Emma and Avery ran toward the supplies like it was Christmas morning, their eyes lighting up as they shouted their ideas to each other. Adam trailed behind them with a quiet smile, carrying their coats over his arm and letting them lead. Jane stayed close at first, hovering between her daughters and Adam, unsure whether she was there as their mother or as some invisible chaperone for her own nerves. But the girls pulled both of them into the moment. Avery tugged Jane to sit down and help cut out butterfly wings while Emma shoved a pair of blunt scissors into Adam's hand and insisted he learn to make a paper crown. By the time an hour had passed, Jane realized she was laughing freely. Not cautiously, not politely, genuinely. Her hands were sticky with glue, Adam had smudges of purple marker on his shirt sleeve, and both girls were wearing uneven crowns they'd made together, completely unaware of the years that had come before. Later, when the tables were cleared and parents were packing up, Avery crawled into Adam's lap without hesitation and rested her head on his shoulder. Emma climbed into Jane's arms. For a long moment, they sat like that, two adults and two children forming something that looked and felt like a family, even if no one said it out loud. Jane caught Adam's gaze across the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. There was something quiet and almost reverent in the way he held Avery, like he was afraid even breathing too loudly would break the moment. After the event, as they walked out into the chilly air, Jane stopped beside Adam in the parking lot. The girls had run ahead to admire a mural on the library wall, and for the first time in weeks, they stood alone. "I saw the article," she said without looking at him. "About the foundation. The school scholarships. The shelters." "I didn't want you to think it was for show," Adam said quickly. "It's not penance. I wanted to be the kind of man who'd deserve them. Even if I never got to be part of their lives." Jane nodded slowly. "I know. That's why I didn't stop you." There was a pause. Adam's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Do you hate me?" She looked at him then, truly looked at him. He wasn't the same man who once walked away from her. His shoulders carried more weight now, his eyes more softness than calculation. There was still strength in him, but it wasn't the kind that pushed everything away, it was the kind that stayed. "I hated you for a long time," she said honestly. "But then I was too busy keeping them alive to waste time on hate. And now I'm not sure what I feel. You're here. You show up. They love you already, and they don't even know who you are to them." Adam's throat tightened. "I don't want to be a secret." "I know," she said. "But I didn't lie to them. I just didn't tell them yet. I was waiting to see if you were real." "I am," he said. "Every day that I missed, I feel it." Jane nodded again and exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of years. "I'm not promising anything," she said. "But I'm not shutting you out, either." Before he could answer, the girls ran back to them, hands full of small stickers the librarian had handed out as prizes. Emma reached for Adam's hand without hesitation, and Avery slipped hers into Jane's. It was simple. It was unspoken. And yet it was everything. They walked down the sidewalk together, for across. To anyone watching, they might have looked like any other family on a weekend outing. But to Jane, it felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, not terrifying, but possible. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was protecting her daughters from the world. She felt like maybe, just maybe, they were stepping into something they had always deserved, a life with more than survival, a life with love, security, and the beginnings of something whole. 6 months had passed since Jane first allowed Adam back into their lives, and everything had shifted, not in dramatic crashes or overwhelming waves, but in quiet, careful steps. The girls now referred to him as Mr. Adam, with ease and familiarity, always asking if he would be joining them for weekend plans, craft fairs, or park picnics. He never missed a moment. If one of them caught a cold, he dropped off soup. When Avery fell and scraped her knee, it was Adam who sat beside her holding a bandage while she told him the story of how the sidewalk jumped up. When Emma wanted someone to watch her practice dancing, it was Adam clapping the loudest in the front row of their living room. But the moment that changed everything came unexpectedly, as most things often do. It was a Sunday morning. Jane was folding laundry in the girls' room when she overheard them whispering. At first, she didn't think much of it. Children whispered about everything from missing crayons to what snack to ask for next. But this was different. "Do you think he's our real daddy?" Avery asked quietly. Emma hesitated. "I think so. He looks like us. And he remembers all our stuff." "What if Mommy says no?" "She won't. I think she loves him. She just forgot for a while." Jane froze. A lump rose in her throat. She hadn't told them yet. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted it to be on solid ground, because she wanted them to know their father not as a title, but as a man who stayed. Who earned it. Who never walked away again. She didn't step into the room then. She let them have that conversation alone, but that night, after dinner, she called Adam and asked if he could come by. When he arrived, the girls were already in their pajamas, curled up under the blanket on the couch. Jane sat on the floor in front of them, legs crossed, and patted the space next to her. Adam sat. There was no ceremony. No script. Just the raw truth. "Girls," she said softly, "we've talked before about families. About how some families look different, right? Some have one parent, some have two, some have grandparents, some have step-parents." The girls nodded. "Well," Jane continued, voice steady but warm, "there's something important I need to tell you. Mr. Adam, he's not just a friend. He's your dad." There was a long pause. No one spoke. The air was filled with the heartbeat of something sacred, something that had waited years to be said. Then Emma leaned forward, staring into Adam's eyes. "I knew it," she said. Avery looked between them, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're our real dad?" Adam swallowed hard. He looked at Jane, who gave him a small nod, and then turned back to them. "Yes. I am. And I'm so sorry I wasn't here before. I didn't know. But I'm here now, and I'll never leave again." The girls didn't say anything for a moment. Then, slowly, Avery stood, walked over, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. Emma followed, pressing her face into his shoulder. Adam held them both, his eyes closing as he breathed in the moment he never thought he'd be allowed to have. He didn't cry. Not there. Not then. But later, after they had gone to bed, Jane found him sitting on the front steps, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. She sat beside him. For a while, they didn't say anything. "Thank you," he said eventually. "I didn't do it for you," she replied, but her voice held no bitterness. "I did it because they deserve the truth. And because you showed me I could trust you with it. I want to be a real part of their lives," he said. "Not just weekends and birthdays. I want to be there in the mornings. I want to read bedtime stories and help with homework. I want to share this with you." Jane looked at him, the man who had once walked away from everything and returned not with excuses but with action. "Then you better be ready," she said. "Because this is the hard part." "I'm ready." Over the next weeks, Adam began coming over in the mornings, helping make lunches and walking the girls to school with Jane. They coordinated schedules, talked about future plans, and started family dinners every Sunday. The girls thrived. They began calling him Dad without hesitation. And slowly, so slowly it almost escaped notice, Jane began to let him into the parts of her heart she had kept barricaded for so long. There was no fairy tale ending. There was no grand wedding or dramatic proposal. But there was peace. There was trust. There was love rebuilt not on apology, but on presence and patience. One night, as Jane tucked the girls into bed and turned off the lights, she found Adam waiting in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea. She took it from him and sat beside him on the couch. He didn't say anything. He just reached for her hand. And this time, she didn't pull away. This story is a powerful reminder that redemption doesn't come in grand gestures, it comes in quiet consistency, in showing up day after day when no one asks you to. Adam's journey from selfish ambition to fatherhood wasn't instant, and that's what made it real. Jane's strength wasn't just in surviving alone, but in knowing when to open her heart again, not for herself, but for her daughters. The ending feels earned, not handed out like a reward. It's not a perfect fairy tale, but something more meaningful, a second chance built on truth, trust, and time. And sometimes, that's the happiest ending of all.